Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. My name is Azadeh Moaveni. I am a former Middle East correspondent for Time magazine and also the author of Lipstick Jihad and Honeymoon in Tehran, and the co-author of Iran Awakening, which is a memoir of Shireen Ebadi, the first Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I feel very, very privileged to be here this evening in conversation with Leila Ahmed, who's Distinguished Professor at Harvard Divinity School. And her new book is called A Quiet Revolution: The Veil's Resurgence from the Middle East to America. And it sets out to chart and explain the rise of the veil from Egypt of the 1970s and 1980s through to its growing popularity today in the United States and Europe. It's a fascinating, extraordinary, remarkable book. I've read it about 1.5 times in the last few days and I admire it so much. I think one of the most important things that it does is that it punctures the hysteria surrounding the veil and the idea of the veil. And it shows us what we're really arguing about so often when we fixate on the veil. We're talking really about immigration and the insularity of Muslim communities and neo-imperial wars. We're talking about racism. And so it really takes us into the subtext of all of these conversations that purport to be about the veil but are really about so many other things. The book isn't really at all a memoir, but it's deeply personal in its own way. And I think this is what makes it extremely appealing and accessible and compelling as well. It frames the subject of the veil through Professor Ahmed's personal experiences as a young woman raised in Cairo of the 1940s by a generation of women who didn't wear the veil at a time when going bareheaded was becoming slowly the mainstream experience in places like Cairo and in other parts of the Middle East. So this approach makes the story deeply personal. We feel like we're accompanying her on this intellectual journey whose destination matters very, very profoundly. So the book traces the historical roots of the veil's resurgence. And this is a really fascinating part of the book, this sort of historical overview of what was going on in the backdrop and what historical and political forces were at play and contributed to the veil becoming more and more commonplace in Cairo and throughout later the rest of the Middle East. So it starts with the emergence of an Islamist political opposition to Gamal Abdel Nasser's socialist and pan-Arabist ideology, the emergence of an Islamist political opposition to Nasser, and Saudi Arabia's rivalry with Egypt for regional dominance. So there's a real sort of political backstory in the region of this opposition going underground and then being supported by Saudi Arabia, and how that get a real sense of how the realpolitik of the region played into all of this, as well as Egyptian domestic politics and that opposition. The backdrop then sort of widens because the Cold War comes to the fore, and the West's support for Islamism and the Afghan Jihad as a front against the Soviet Union. So the first part of the book looks at all of this and how the resurgence of the veil is often, and I'm quoting here, a quintessential sign, among other things, of irresolvable tension and confrontation between Islam and the West. So that was true in the 19th and 20th centuries as a part of the ethos of the colonial project, this notion that the civilized West, and in the case of Egypt, civilized Britain, was rescuing these inferior societies from their backward ways, the idea of white men saving brown women from brown men. And it really traces the arc, and it shows us how startlingly unchanged the rhetoric is between that 19th and 20th century colonial project and this idea of rescuing the backwards to today, where the niqab in France and in other parts of Europe, veiling has come to be symbolic of backwards people living in our midst who need to be civilized. The second part of the book, which I particularly admire, is about Islam in America. And I think it offers us one of the fullest, most complete, and really hopeful portraits of Islam in America today. It's concentrates on the veil and the question of women in Islam in America. But I think for me, it's one of the most important sort of overviews of where we've come in America with Islam in the last 10 years. It explores how women are playing an unprecedented and central role in Muslim life in America, how they are now playing more influential and important roles at the head of Muslim organizations in America, and how in the climate that has come about in the wake of 9/11, how these Muslim organizations are becoming so much more receptive to criticism and tolerant of dissenting opinion. So this is a time now where dissenters and critics are invited to conferences and are actually listened to. Gender inequality is debated, and young Muslims in America are challenging the much more conservative social mores of their parents, imported from these home countries. So it is, as she writes, a new moment in history, in the history of Islam as well as America. Something that I found that I really identified with in this book that I want to start with asking you about is sort of your personal view of how the veil has changed. And you write very honestly about how women from middle class and upper class, very often educated backgrounds in the Middle East, so reflexively view the veil as something alien, something that's fundamentally uncomfortable and discomforting, and how it seems like it's a rejection of more private piety, that it's a rejection of mainstream values, and the sense that those veiled women are somehow sitting in judgment of us, the unveiled Muslim woman. And the book starts with a really compelling scene at Harvard, where you're with a feminist friend, and you see a group of women covered in veils, and you see them as the enemy because they are so opposed to what you would stand for. They're the people, I think your friend says it, these are the people who get our books banned. They are the enemy. And by the end of the book, your position has completely changed. So can you tell us how these women went from being the enemy to something not so threatening at all?
Well, I'll try to answer you, but let me just say I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for being here. And I want to thank you, Azadeh, and it's a privilege to have you there. And for this extraordinary summary, I wish I'd read it when I was starting the book. I'd have known how to write the book. Yes. So how did I go from there? But actually, from being myself shocked and reacting against hijab, and out of really a very complicated history, because I wasn't simply reacting. I mean, one might assume, as a feminist, I would be reacting against the hijab for feminist reasons, because it reinscribes male dominance and all of that, and female subordination. That was part of it, but that was only a small part of it. And the reason I reacted as strongly as I did, I had been raised among aunts and relatives and mothers of friends and so on, all of whom did not wear hijab, many of whom were actually quite devout, and they thought the hijab was completely irrelevant. So what was this about? It's got nothing to do with Islam and piety, from my perspective. So, and it was about, and I mean, as it happens, okay, so I began this book, and my response to this veiling was in the late 1990s. Well, what was going on in the late 1990s? The first beginnings of unease in the West because of these immigrants, particularly the hijabis. People who looked like me and spoke like me were not that much of a problem. It was the people who wore headscarves. And then, so that was in the West, and the whole business of how these alien people are going to adjust to Western values was there. And frankly, I was asking that myself, because I regarded them as kind of backward and alien. But the other thing that was going on in Egypt, which is where I'm from, and I was not there, and I had left Egypt long ago, but I followed what was happening. And what was happening is Egypt was becoming transformed from a country where people did not wear hijab to a place where they did. And along with that had come, and that was the scary part, violence. There had become, books were banned. The Nobel laureate Naguib Mahfouz was stabbed. He'd been published books for decades. Nobody bothered. Now he was called a blasphemer, and somebody tried to kill him. A writer, a journalist, in fact, for Foda, who was actually a devout Muslim, but very opposed to Islamic fundamentalism, was killed. So all of this, I was getting this news along with watching the people putting on hijab. So in my mind, and I had not studied this, I assumed that hijab, fundamentalism, all of this was part of one dangerous mix. And that was really why the sight of the hijab was as scary as it was. Now, how I came to think differently, I don't know how to say. Yeah, I think you could probably say, having heard you, it took me the entire book, 10 years of work on rethinking. And I was very, very resistant. I mean, it took a long time for me to adjust to the fact that the hijab was not actually a sign of oppression. You know, it's just dress, which has been imbued with powerful symbolism. Actually, to be honest, by imperialists. And there's the whole. Originally, the British and the French, French and Algeria had a critical role, and they would ceremoniously, to show how they were civilizing people, they would introduce women into public performance, and they would actually lift their veils to show that they had now become civilized people. So this notion of the veil as sign of backwardness, compared in particular to the West. And you know, the ironic thing, I had actually written about this in my previous book. I had written about how colonialism had, the reason Muslims had unveiled and had been because of the colonial notion that veiling symbolized backwardness, and Muslims had wanted to throw off backwardness. And I wrote about the chroma. You know, you were telling me something earlier about that you noticed the. What were you saying?
Yes. Well, Cromer, who was, I don't remember, he was a colonial official in Egypt at the time, and was opposed to women's suffrage in Britain, but refused also to fund women's schooling, primary school for girls in Egypt, but making this issue of the veil.
That's right. He had to unveil. But he was not only opposed to women's suffrage, he was the president of the association opposed to women's suffrage. So, and he was claiming in Egypt to be pro-feminist, pro-women, wanting them to unveil a sign of liberation. So when you begin, so I had written this. So that's amazing to me that I had written this, I think 20 years ago, an article analyzing how all of that had happened. And yet here I was, nevertheless, reacting myself 10 years later to the hijab as a backward thing. So it was a tremendous education on the ways in which whatever is implanted in our heads, we believe. We bizarrely believe it until we're forced to see actually it's an unreasonable idea. Well,
The second part of the book that explores the resurgence of the veil in the West, I think, does a very deft job of looking at what does it exactly mean now. And I think a lot of what you discover in the process of looking at that question seems to be part of what makes you more comfortable with the resurgence as a whole and what it has come to mean. And especially, I think a lot of the research that you mention and the testimonies of young women in the second part of the book talk about, and women tell researchers, and you show this, how they wear the veil for, especially in the context of life after September 11th, as something that affirms their identity at a time when they're feeling so discriminated against. And in a way, as almost empowering, sort of not reclaiming the veil, but using it as a symbol of their activism, and a way to really challenge what they feel is the inequality of mainstream society. And very interesting also, so many women seem to say that they wear it to show their support for the Palestinian cause. And it's sort of emblematic of their activism and their support for Palestine. And so I was very intrigued by this, how it seems as though really it's not at all, in cases, an objective measure of piety. You don't necessarily know how devout this woman is, how pious it is. So it's a veil no longer really a measure of piety, but almost an emblem of activism, or an accessory of activism.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, of course, that is in the West, because that's really critical to bear in mind. I don't think it means that in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. It's where you are. So the meaning of the veil shifts according to what country we're talking about. And these kind of implicit protest meanings, including about gender, sex, against sexism. Some of them wear it because they're opposed to sexism as a way of making people aware of the sexism of Western dress. And after all, these are the inheritors, I mean, of feminism, the history of feminism, which also did bra burning and all sorts of other things about protest against women's dress. So these are people who are very aware of this, this dimension. So it does have all those meanings, including political meanings. Now, there was something you said that I wanted to follow up on.
Palestine and that sort of element of it, and also whether it's something that you can no longer assume that because a woman is wearing this.
Yes.
Because it's almost hard when you come out of. I've lived so much of the past decade in Iran, and when I'm sort of conditioned to seeing a woman in a veil in the West, I would think, you know, if this is, you know, if I'm with my husband, he shouldn't go shake her hand, and that there has to be a sort of distance observed, and that it signals certain things about the sort of comfort and the social mores and the practice that this woman observes, and it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case anymore. You don't, do you know? And is this ambiguity part of the veil no longer becoming? Does it seem to you that the ambiguity of it now seems to be part of why we can't necessarily connect it to this sort of garment of oppression, as part of what the religion oppresses and patriarchy, really?
Yes. I think there are 2 points I want to follow up. One is about its ambiguity, but what I remember as you were talking, one of the things is what they say. If you ask them, if journalists ask them, or anthropologists or academics ask them, people like myself, I mean, I found, you know, I didn't disguise who I was when I asked these questions. So quite a lot of them gave me profoundly feminist answers, and I can't but think that they were aware of who they were speaking to and were tailoring their answers, which I'm sure they do with everybody. So one of the questions is, well, they don't often say, I'm doing it because I'm obeying God. That is not an answer they give either to anthropologists or to journalists. It doesn't mean that this is not what that's not part of their motivation. It just means that that's not what they want to make public. So that's an important, so we don't really know. So there are all kinds of possible meanings, but we have to understand that people answering your questions know very well you're trying to study Muslims and want to convey a particular impression. So they don't necessarily want to tell you what's exactly in their heart. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also there are complexities of motivations. I mean, people wear it because they want to, it's a way of belonging to a community. There are many possible layers. I've again forgotten what your question was.
Yes, no, well, but I think that this is something that you highlight in a very intelligent and interesting way in the book, this question of how can we really ultimately get the meaning of why women wear it when there is this very sort of palpable sort of civilizational static in the air when a woman, a journalist or a researcher sits in front of a woman. I was sitting on the train coming here, and there were these young women, you know, in their very modern hijab. We used to call them at the American University in Cairo when I was there, we would call them the sexy mahajjabat. And then, you know, if I went to ask them, you know, and said, I'm a journalist and I'd really like to know why you wear this because of this and this and this, you know, what would they ultimately tell me? Would they tell me, even if it were the case, because my father is quite stern and I wear this and it gives me a bit of freedom, actually. I can be out with my friends and it's a sort of protective layer. But would they admit that to me? Because that's quite a personal thing to have to admit, that perhaps there's even an opportunistic reason that you're wearing that
I mean, this partly goes back to, it's a very intrusive question. I don't go around asking anybody else, why do you dress the way you dress? So, you know, we dress for all kinds of reasons. How would you explain why you dress, you know? That's, so I think that's part of it. But I think there has been something has happened between if you go back to the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and you go to Egypt or most Muslim majority countries, the people who were wearing hijab were Christians, Muslims, and Jews, not just Muslims. It was only after the unveiling began and that the colonials named it as an Islamic, backward Islamic practice, that it became Islamic. Until then, everybody wore it. It was normal dress. There was no... So I think what has happened with the resurgence is that women now are defining what it means. Something is, and what the critical difference is, it's really women's agency. It's up to women to decide what it means. Whoever wears it decides what it means. And that has only happened since the 1970s. And of course, it only happens in countries where women are free to choose whether to wear it. It doesn't happen in Saudi Arabia or Iran, or even where there's a lot of social pressure. And I'm told in Egypt that it's very hard not to wear it. So this freedom to make it mean whatever you want it to mean is a Western phenomenon, post-1990s Western phenomenon.
This leads me to the next question that I had for you, and that it's about sort of the shadow that Saudi Arabia, I feel, casts in this book. It's a very long shadow. And I was extremely, as someone who's lived in the region for many years and has covered, everything that Saudi Arabia is up to in the region, it was quite... I was not really prepared to sort of see the arc of Saudi involvement in the Whale, from Saudi Arabia's nurturing and supporting of the Muslim Brotherhood when they were basically expelled from Egyptian political life. And so many of these Muslim brothers went to Saudi Arabia and lived and worked there and were even more influenced by conservative Islam, by living in this much more conservative place. And of course the Muslim Brotherhood, as you write, was at the forefront of bringing the veil back into Egyptian life through its political project and that kind of Islamism. And then later, again, in the West, specifically in America, you write about how Saudi Arabia, at least in the early decades of Muslim activism in America, was one of the primary funders and backers of these main Muslim organizations.
That's in Europe too.
In America and Europe. And these were, as you show us, quite... the people who joined and ran these organizations were in the spectrum of Muslim immigrant in the West, quite conservative. And so the dominant face of Islam in these community organizations became quite Islamist. And eventually they broke with the Saudis because the Saudis wanted them to support the first Gulf War and the communities did not. But by that time they had been quite institutionalized and their character had sort of taken shape. So I guess what I want to ask is, even though, and I really buy that the veil now to a large extent in the West reflects women's agency. I buy that, and I believe in that. But do you think also that it's somehow a success story, a remarkable success story for Saudi Arabia and its ability to sort of send its conservative sort of reading of Islam and the fact that it's mandatory for women into the West all of these decades later?
I think you're absolutely right, but it's a very double-edged success because, it's turning out to mean what they didn't want it to mean. Women are free to reinterpret both the veil and as the Islam that they so exported, so made such an effort to export. I mean, I don't think Saudi Arabia will approve with a lot of things that are happening among even the conservative, even the highly covered, and not only with headscarves but with, elaborate long robes and so on. I think they are taking... Some of the most active ones are taking very strong feminist lines, which I bet Saudi Arabia wouldn't too much approve of. So it's I think they might. I think the issue of what happens when you're in a democracy. So you tell people you have to veil, and this is part of your religion. Okay, and they do so, but they begin to. They're active people who are capable now of defining religion. That's what's happened, by the way, across all religions in America. I gather Europe is much less religious on the whole than America, but certainly we have now women rabbis. You wouldn't have never had that a few decades ago. Women priests. All of this is what happens when you allow people to think for themselves, and you have no way of stopping them. And so I think Saudi Arabia has released, and the Muslim Brotherhood have released something that could well transform Islam even back home someday, back in their countries.
This transforming of Islam in America by exactly this, especially this younger generation of Muslims many of whom are embracing the veil. Interestingly, many of whom had embraced it and then rejected it. I think that's a very interesting
yes, that's
strand
right. It is
as
interesting.
well.
Yes, yes.
Women whose mothers perhaps had not worn the veil assumed the veil for sort of various reasons, many of them activist and to do with associating or affirming that kind of community identity and then taking it off. But I think what I wanted to come to, and I think that's very interesting that you say that Saudi Arabia would be disappointed at the sort of perhaps a hollow victory for the Saudis in the end, because, and it, in the sense that, as you say, it's become, women may be wearing the veil, but they're part of a community of Muslims in the United States. It's becoming more open to interfaith dialogue, more open to dissent, and more open to a younger generation challenging gender segregation than ever before. And I think it's very instructive, the history that you recount of how all of that happened and has been happening in the United States after 9/11. And it made me think that perhaps it's the conversation that Europe needs to be having more of. And the question of really how do these very insular, conservative Muslim immigrant communities, how do they open up? Because I think that's also part of what's happening, part of what has happened in America is that these communities have come of age, and through time and through interfaith dialogue and through mixing, they have become more open. And in a way, their Islam has become more open through that, and I don't see that as much in Europe, and I wonder, how do you see these two communities in the West sort of evolving in two separate trajectories?
Maybe for the moment. I think the issue of generations is very important, because it's not that the immigrants are becoming more open-minded. They may well be still where they are, but their children are born in the West. They have all the assumptions that Westerners have about their rights. And it's their generation that's changing things, that are questioning the old ways of doing so without rejecting Islam, so that they're actually quite committed Muslims. I think, I guess one of the distinctions I want to make is that, I mean, it's true that Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia were very important to shaping the kind of activist Islam which I'm calling Islamist, and many people call Islamist. I think many of the young people who grew up in that form just think it's Islam, and they probably don't accept it as Islamist. They think they're just Muslims, and people like you and me are just not Muslims. That's really the issue. So it's not that. So whereas my argument is that there's been a shift, and there are now multiple kinds of Islam. One of them more dominant has become dominant, but our old style form of Islam is kind of fading.
That's quite, because that's something that I very much feel sometimes when I see these young women activists wearing the veil and so committed, and I feel somewhat, and I think I feel excluded from their activism and their interpretation of Islam. And I see, and even when I was at university, the Muslim student associations, and they were so much more observant. And I did feel that my way of being a Muslim, sort of by heritage and by culture, and it being so much a part of my life and a part of my family life, was to them, to that sort of understanding of Islam, so inadequate. And something that I think is very important that you bring out in the second part of this book is how that kind of private Islam, the sort of Islam that you grew up with and that I identify with, and that is part of my sort of cultural heritage, is perhaps, and as you write, at least in America, is the mainstream. This not activist Islam, not identifying loudly and assertively as a Muslim, that being sort of a dominant part of your life. And that's, I think, something that doesn't get across at all in the media. I think because these activist Muslims are so at the forefront of the media and they get so much attention, that it becomes the understanding that all Muslims are this devout. So many of them wear the veil and they pray, and the fact that there's this huge silent majority of secular Muslims in the West just doesn't seem to surface. And I wanted to ask you how complicit you think the media is in creating that sense.
Well, I don't think that it's an issue of complicity. I think so you just used the word secular about the non-veiled, non-activist Islamists. Well, I wouldn't use the word secular. I think some of them are quite deeply religious. but they don't. Then it's not about being publicly religious. It's not being wearing the signs that identify you as Muslim. But it's another valid way of being Muslim. I mean, we know there are many ways of being Christian or Jewish. So I think the whole notion that women who don't do Islam in that observant, officially observant, visibly observant way are secular, I think that has to be challenged. I don't think it's true. And I think it's a part of the mythology of exactly these people. They defined us as secular, so don't pay attention to them. I think that divide is, so when you say is the media complicit, I mean the thing is the most mosques or most Islamic organizations in America, and I expect in Europe too, are actually controlled by people who believe this kind of activist Islam. So they're in positions of authority. So one can't really blame the media for going to them for information. And it's a complicated subject. There's no pope in Islam. There's nobody who can say, actually, these people who don't veil may be just as Muslim as anybody else, you know. So it's a complicated situation. Yeah.
Well, I think they're certainly very adept at reaching out to the media and very media savvy, these organizations. And I think that perhaps what I feel is that the media sort of, and this is sort of partly just the nature of the news, sort of will grasp onto whatever, there's a headline, something is happening. Right. And so very often the news is about the veil and some controversy surrounding the veil. And so it seems as though there's this kind of sort of polarization, this fight between these people who reject the veil and are not extreme, but very ardent Muslim feminists and hold women-led prayers and mixed prayers, and that receives a lot of attention. Then on the other hand, you have the very pious imams who will come out and say very conservative things that then get a lot of attention. And between sort of covering this whole, the middle ground is just, it seems as though they don't exist.
That's right. But it's also a complicated question because, you know, as you were saying, in America, and I think also in Europe, the people who wear hijab and who follow that more conservative form of Islam actually make up the minority of Muslims. The majority are just blending into the rest of society and going about their business. So if your job is not to speak in your identity as Muslim, then what are you going to tell the media, and how are you going to, in your person as what are you going to speak to the media? So it's a very complex issue. Yes.
Sort of this idea of what the media picks up on and what generates attention is a theme that I think you explore very fruitfully in the book, especially in the wake of September 11th and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the ways in which particularly the Bush administration sold and packaged these wars, especially the war in Afghanistan, as the sort of the moral shorthand for it was we're going to rescue the women of Afghanistan from the burqa. And this whole sort of cottage industry sprung up of books about Afghan women suffering, and it became sort of the equation that we've gone to war there to rescue them because they're so oppressed, and every other month there would be a bestseller, and I followed that line with a lot of interest because I certainly feel that that's the case in the sense of this publishing industry phenomenon of these books, and you write about it as the sort of manufacturing of consent for these wars. At the same time, something that left me a bit perplexed was the discussion of some of the Muslim women who themselves are writing these books about their experiences particularly in countries where a very right-wing form of Islam is practiced. And you mentioned Azar Nafisi and reading Lolita in Tehran, and critics who've accused this book of basically warmongering on behalf of the Bush administration, and referring to these kind of works as native testimonials, sort of putting the rhetoric sort of in the mouths of the brown women who need to be rescued. And And what I wanted to ask, I suppose, from my perspective as an Iranian woman who has spent many years living under a very right-wing government that last year just wanted to, again, stone a woman for adultery and practices the most sort of fundamentalist Islam. Women's testimony in a court counts for half of a man, and could go on and on and on. But I wanted to ask you, sort of, in this climate, in this political climate, and in this media climate where that kind of critique can be very easily exploited or fall into these kind of lines of rhetoric that then spiral, sort of how do you carve out a space for a secular critique of Islam that doesn't then fall into sort of the hands of Fox News? Where's the space for that?
A very tough question. I think you're absolutely right. I think probably you mentioned some of the other books that I mentioned, like Irshad Manji, The Trouble with Islam, or Ayan Hirsi Ali, what is it called, Caged Virgin or something. Yes. I really don't think there's any substance in most of them, both those two examples. Mm-hmm. So I do think they are really catering to, they're offering exactly what, they're not women who know very much about Islam. They present their own personal experience, which is valid as their personal experience, but not as a platform to generalize about this. Let me put it another way. If somebody wrote a book like that about Judaism or Christianity, it probably would not be published. Everybody would see immediately that this is, abusive, untrue. If you present it simply as your personal experience, one thing, but as a critique of a religion which you haven't studied and know except other beyond your own, that would not be accepted. So that's really what I'm pointing to there. I think Nafisi is a more complicated case. So I don't. Though I quote these people, and I say there are people who are very critical of them, I at the end do not say that one can judge the intentions of the author. Mm-hmm. I think how it's received is all we can. We can see that the reason, what they argue that the reason these books become popular is because they're being supported by a right-wing machine, and that because in pursuit of particular goals, whether politics against immigrants or whether it's support for the Iran war. And I think so. The politics of reception is what I would emphasize here, rather than what are these authors up to. And even Manji and Hirsi, I see some virtue in their work, so I wouldn't totally dismiss it. Yeah.
Yes, I think it does. It sort of gets enveloped in, like you say, the politics of that reception. That's right, yeah. And it becomes this very sort of contested cultural terrain.
Yes.
But it does seem as though that space doesn't really perhaps the politics of the reception and perhaps of the publishing industry as well, and the way that these books are marketed sort of creates a very sort of fertile and specific way for them to be received.
I think it is about publication as well. Because people are suffering all over the world. Why is it only books about Muslim women suffering that, become bestsellers?
Yes, the sort of the airport genre of the Saudi woman.
That's right. Yeah.
Being purloined somewhere and against her will. Sort of swinging back to Egypt, because this is something that that I've been thinking a lot about in the recent weeks, as we've seen the Tahrir Square uprising sort of evolve and turn into a revolution and eventually oust Mubarak. You really chart how Islamism, how the dream of the Muslim Brotherhood was to spread their message of Islam to the point where veiling and that kind of activist, more conservative Islam became the mainstream practice in Egypt. That was the sort of dream of the Muslim Brothers in the 60s and 70s. That was what they were working towards. And you write about how ultimately they did achieve that. That became mainstream practice in Egypt. And having lived in Egypt and seen so many, having seen the veil become entrenched in the middle class and really the success of that Muslim Brotherhood project. I wanted to ask you about how you see the future of this youth revolt in Egypt, and how exceptional it is really that there were no calls for religion, there were no calls for an Islamic state from Tahrir Square. And I think I guess the heart of my question is, do you feel that becoming mainstream has somehow tempered or mellowed or even secularized the political agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood in a way?
I don't know. I don't think I can answer for the Muslim Brotherhood, but I mean, I think what we saw in Tahrir Square was, as you say, religion was not missing. It was actually very present, because we saw Christians protecting Muslims so they could pray. We saw Muslims supporting Christians. I can't recall what the situation was, but we saw, so religion was present. People were personally religious. There were a lot of women wearing hijab, but there was no expression of religion as a political requirement, as we want an Islamic state. There was nothing of that. So I think that I do think all that was very hopeful. Yeah.
There's so much worry in the West, of course, that this will be the moment where the Islamists will sort of dive into the fray and exploit what's happened in Egypt and turn it in that direction. And as you say, we haven't really seen that happening. We don't. The demands of these young Egyptians have been so secular, even the very religious ones that we've seen. I think the only thing that I've noticed coming out of Tahrir Square that is perhaps reflective of that activist Islamist ideology is this idea that in the new Egypt, foreign policy vis-a-vis Palestine will be different, that it will reflect a sort of more robust kind of support for the Palestinian position, and in a way that's not calling for an Islamic state. That's sort of, in a way, the sort of activism that you write about in the West sort of being reflected back in this young generation in Egypt. That is a sort of extent, if you will, of their Islamism. And if that's the extent of it, it doesn't seem particularly sinister or worrisome.
Yeah, I think that, the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism in general, it's such a, I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of people. And then, for one thing, the Muslim Brotherhood varies from one country to another. Its history and Hamas was a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, completely different from its history in Egypt or elsewhere. So I think, and within Egypt, it's an organization that's existed for 80 years that had a varied history. There's the strange of its history. So I wouldn't know how to generalize about them. There are too many different opinions, too many. So it really would depend again who within the Muslim Brotherhood would become influential. And I think the whole mix, I don't think they are the sole danger thing to fear in Egypt, but I have no idea. I mean, the issue is people who come into power and hold on to power, and what they will do, we don't know. But I do think the spirit of the revolution was tremendous. I think even if they do not achieve in the short run, in the immediate term, what they set out to do, I think it was a wonderful example to the world of what a non-violent group of people working together can achieve. It was extraordinary. And they even cleaned up afterwards. So
yes, yes, yes. No, that's amazing, exceptional. I think we're going to now take all of your questions, and they've asked that you definitely please take the microphone before you ask your question. So starting there, right behind you, actually.
Sorry, I missed what date, what year, decade you said that Jews, Christians and Muslims wore the veil. I missed it when I think you said
at the end of the 19th and early 20th century.
Thanks.
Because we know that there were lots of women's journals at the time, and people wrote in saying, well, I have unveiled, but I don't know, my friend is resisting it. And we know, for instance, that one of the famous, actually famous Egyptian Marxist journalist, Coptic journalist, whose name was, his last name is Musa, I can't remember his first name, told us that his mother and sister, and they were Copts, i.e. Christians, unveiled in 1908. So it was a common practice across religions.
Hello, I'm Mimma Lehtovaara. I'm a Reuters journalist fellow at Oxford University. I'm from Finland. I'm a journalist, and Mohamed Morsi, who is the chairman for the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, which is based on the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. He visited Oxford last week and he told about their politics and their goals. Yeah. And he told that they are pro-Islamistic country and they want Egypt law. It should be based on Sharia. But he didn't answer the question what kind of Sharia this could be. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, do you have any idea of the Egypt Muslim Brotherhood and this party, the Freedom and Justice? What is their idea of Sharia and what is their idea of the position of women? How would that law affect women in Egypt?
Yeah. I actually don't know, and that's one of the things I have to say. I'm not an expert either on the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I looked at how it intersected with women, and nor do I follow the latest politics, which is what you're talking about. So I couldn't really answer that. I do know that in the course of the debates that I followed about women and about Sharia, one of the people I quote, and I can't remember his name right now, is one of the leading figures in the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s, I think, said, well, we can't have Sharia because Egypt has to be a model, and Sharia has to be something that takes into account where we are today, and it has to be rethought in terms of what our understanding of justice is today. And so Egypt cannot easily apply or introduce law or Sharia because it will have to take in the issues of justice today. So that means at least in the 80s there were people thinking about it. And some of the debates that I also quote are again around the 1980s to what was the debates that were going on in the Brotherhood then. So I don't know whether they apply today, but the debates that were going in then included, do women have rights? They have rights to some of. There were disagreements among the lead, but all of them tended to agree that there's no question that the primary responsibility is to raise the children. But they also, a lot of them also said, if she's able to fulfill that, she can do whatever work she wants, including head of state. It may be that one exception is head of state. I can't recall. But anyway, they can do pretty well most things. So these were the debates that were going on then. That's why I say it's a very varied, I'm sure even in the 80s, those I were looking at were probably among the most liberal of them. So where they are today, but that means that there are debates within them. There is a history of discussion of these questions, and one can't simply, say they believe this or believe that. There are too many of them, and it's too long a history. I don't know if they're as smart today as they were in the 80s. I don't know.
I think that you include this sort of sketch, this portrait of Zainab al-Ghazali, yes. This woman who was a leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood, and her personal example, although she never sort of rose to hold an official position, she never had children. Her entire life was work vis-a-vis the Brotherhood, but this was her passion.
Islamism, not Brotherhood, but
and ended up divorcing one husband because she felt that her marital duties interfered with her work.
She said that plainly. She had a contract with her husband. If our marriage interferes with my work in the service of Islam, I will divorce you. And she divorced him. So.
Yes. So the paradoxes of that case and that portrait, I think, really sort of highlight the tensions
very, very complicated. So
even within
that's right.
Even within Egyptian society, and I think
no one that I know criticized her for doing this. So, even the most strict Muslim brothers. So. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Terry. I'm a reader in social and contextual theology at Oxford Brookes University. I'd like to just first address my question to the chair. I'm sorry I didn't get your name.
It's okay. Azadeh.
You began by describing Western objections to the hijab as hysterical or hysteria. And this is a discourse that ironically has been part of a narrative of sexism in Western cultures, describing women as hysterical when they object to things, is key to Western constructions of women as overwhelmed by emotion and essentially irrational. I'd like to also address, Leila, your claim that the hijab has been imbued with powerful symbolism by Western colonialism and not by Islamic patriarchy.
I didn't say not by. I said that both have used it. Yeah.
I guess you're saying primarily it's imbued with powerful symbolism by Western colonialism.
No.
Do you deny the widespread use of the veil as a tool for female segregation and oppression within patriarchal forms of Islam?
Not for a second, no.
You have said, you've acknowledged, I think, that it's only in Western cultures, not where Sharia law is enforced, which is 35 nations around the world, where women have the freedom to make it mean whatever they want it to mean. But since this is only possible in Western culture, does this meaning that women make of the hijab have no relationship whatsoever to its meaning in Islamist cultures? And analogously, could we say that, you know, if a person of color were to don a pair of shackles or a KKK hood, that would have no symbolism beyond whatever he or she wants it to mean? And finally, you did mention another argument that I hear quite often in attempts to obfuscate on this issue, which is that the veil is a form of resistance to the West's sexualization and objectification of women. And the argument seems to be that we, no less than Islamic cultures, pressure women into adopting various forms of dress or undress that are intended for the male gaze or to turn us into sex objects. This implies, first, that feminists don't oppose the sexualization of the female body within their own culture.
Sorry to interrupt, but can I ask you to sort of accelerate towards the question part?
Or maybe you could just accelerate towards the answers.
Well, I think you sort of went on a segue, so could you just, in a very sort of brief, encapsulated form, what your primary question is for Professor Ahmed?
Are you suggesting that Western women, first of all, don't oppose the sexualization of the female body within our own culture, or that if we don't oppose that sexualization, that we're bad feminists because we actually see it as liberating and empowering for women as sexual subjects?
Okay, let me try to answer that. I think I may have said, or I meant to say, one of the things that happens with American feminism, I think probably Western feminism, I mean Muslim feminists who say that they're using the veil in part to challenge sexism of the West, they are Westerners. They are no less than you, thoroughly informed on bad feminism. They know the history of feminism protests against sexual dress. They know the history of bra burning, or so-called bra burning. They know how feminists have protested exactly against what they are now taking on also as Americans. So I don't think it's they're unaware. I'm not saying that feminists are not. On the contrary, I think they probably learned a lot of these arguments from feminists of the 60s and 70s. So I don't see really any contradiction there.
Hello. I have a question. First of all, I would say thank you for what seems to me to be a very frank admission of your patient reappraisal of your sense of the veil. There's a kind of... yeah.
Why not stand?
So thank you for what seemed to me a very frank reappraisal, or frank confession of your reappraisal of the veil, and that seemed to me a model of the kind of thinking that we might have to, in the West, might have to learn to overcome the rigidity of our sense of what the veil means. I think that's a great model. I have a question, but just in response to your if I can, just in response to your question, I think one of the things you seem to be saying was that we need to interrogate this is implicit, I think, in your comments, that we need to be interrogating the coding of unveiling as a kind of freedom. That seems to me to be very important, that there's something about an equation about exposure equaling freedom, which I think is inimical in lots of ways. And I think that seems implicit in your comments today. But the question I wanted to ask was also that, you know, it seems to me that there's a a kind of over-determination of the veil. The veil means freedom, the veil means oppression, the veil means fashion. And that's indicative of our anxieties about the veil. It means so many things. It's protean. We're anxious about that. And the counter of that is to say that for lots of the women who wear the veil, that ambiguity, I think that's the word you used, is also something very liberating. That not that wearing the veil itself is liberating, but that the veil is resistant to a kind of interpretation. And what, in a way, the kind of discourse that we're engaging in is itself a kind of coding of the veil. And I'm anxious about that in some ways. I think the ideal is perhaps to go towards a kind of normalization of the veil, where we're not interrogating what it means, just that it is, the veil isn't a cross, the veil is a veil. It's a kind of an indication, it's a kind of signal of resistance to that exposure to our urgency for a kind of meaning. So I kind of want to put that to you. There's a kind of critique there, but also an enormous compliment to you, I think, for your rethinking of the veil.
Well, thank you very much for the comments, and for the critique, which I actually completely agree with. I think we do have to get past, and I can't tell you the number of Muslim women who wear hijab or who used to wear hijab who've told me we're just so bored of this subject. It's a dress. You don't go around asking why are you wearing this particular shirt or this style of dress, or it's a dress. Forget it. Let's forget it. So I think you're absolutely right. But unfortunately we're caught up in a political moment in which these things carry enormous emotional weight, political weight. So I don't know how we can stop. But ideally, I think you're right. We should stop.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm just intrigued that during today's or this evening's discussion, we haven't made any distinction between wearing hijab, wearing veil, and isn't there a huge distinction between choosing or being forced to cover one's hair and being forced to cover one's face, particularly with relations you're talking
Yes.
Western. And isn't it, anthropologically in terms of communicating with people via face? And do you not see any distinction between those?
No, well, thank you very much for that point. It's a very important point. It's really, I use it in the colloquial English sense, which means any sort of covering, which can be a head covering. Usually that's what I mean by it, but it can also mean faces. So I'm not using, when I say veil, I'm not talking about face covering. I am talking about mainly, and I think I probably say that in the book, I repeatedly say it's headscarf, hijab, head covering, so something. So I'm mainly speaking about head covering. Probably the same thing would to some extent, but more complexly and more differently apply to face veil.
Thanks. Clive Baldwin, Human Rights Watch, and thank you to you both for a very illuminating discussion. I just wondered, Professor Ahmed, if you could say a little bit more about whether you see class as making much of a difference, especially in immigrant communities in Europe and the United States. So I'm just thinking, a couple of years ago, we did a report on the ban on headscarves in some German state schools. And one of the most powerful lines from one of the teachers we spoke to was, they didn't care about our hijab when we were cleaners. Meaning, when we were cleaners.
I see.
In their mother's generations who were cleaners. It's only when she said, when they became teachers, lawyers, professionals, and more public, that seemed to be seen as a threat by the authorities. But just more broadly, do you see much difference between the classes?
That's a wonderful point. Thank you. I actually don't think that the parallel is the same in America. And I think, I don't know enough about it I don't want to say something off the top of my head, but I think it's not the same. By the way, that reminds me that at some point you said about immigrants and the Islamism and so on. In America, something like 35 to 40% of Muslims are African Americans, so they're as native as you can get. They're not immigrants at all. And the hijab is also common among them. So I think that's a very important point. I'm not sure that it does actually transfer to the across Atlantic, but I'm sure class is extraordinarily important. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that 10 years ago you did a positive correlation between the resurgence of the veil and jihadism and Islamism and the violence. Now you're saying, and I will find out about your book. So, but I'm curious, and I'd like to know. So, what happened in the Middle East that made women, whether they chose or they were forced to, what happened that explained the fact that they're wearing the veil a lot more than they did when you grew up? If it's not due to Islamism, jihadism, and the pressure of...
It is due to Islamism, but not jihadism. Islamists, or the majority, are non-violent and not concerned. They're out to change society through education, through spreading their ideas, through communication, not through violence. So Islamist is not violent. The more than 90% of Islamists, 95%, according to the statistics, that I'm not an expert on violent Islamism or militancy, but according to people who study them, say it's maybe between 2 and 4% of Islamists who are violent. The majority, and that's partly why they succeed, are committed to gradually working to bring about the change they want, by educating others, by teaching others, by drawing them in, not by trying to be violent. So the hijab did spread through Islamism, but not through violent jihadists. And moreover, now that once it has spread, which was by the 80s or 90s, the people who now wear hijab, who are now in their 20s, have no idea that it has this history. For them, it's just normal dress. It's just being a Muslim, as a normal Muslim. So all this history is not part of ordinary young person wearing hijab. They don't know it. They just were raised Muslim, and that's what they were taught Islam requires. So for most people, there is no connection whatever between jihadism and hijab.
Yeah, I just want to interject there. I think that the political backdrop that you frame with the rise of Islamism in Egypt is very useful to looking at this sort of link between jihadism, Islamism, and the veil, because you show that the Muslim Brotherhood in part sort of became ascendant in Egypt as a dissident movement to the secular first pan-Arab and socialist sort of Nasser regime, and then the Sadat regimes that followed. Right. So in a way, this whole sort of political backdrop of rising up, and you sort of capture this moment, the 1967 war and the defeat against Israel, and how sort of European society just sort of collapsed and turned inwards.
Egyptian society.
Yes, and there was this sort of emotional moment where they felt that they had been so defeated, and it was really at that moment that the Muslim Brotherhood and the sort of that kind of resistance, or not resistance, I won't use that word specifically, thank you, but that kind of opposition to the Egyptian government sort of rose up. So I think there's a very powerful sort of economic and political regional sort of backdrop to all of this happening, not just sort of the jihadist strain of the Muslim Brotherhood is one thing, but there's that whole context of economic decline under Nasser, feeding the Muslim Brotherhood, defeat at the hand of Israel, and all of that working together. And I think you sort of really weave that very richly, and I think that's part of the answer to your question as well.
I'm curious. I remember a few years ago, there was a bit in the news about an imam in Egypt, in Cairo, who had visited a school.
Who what,
sorry, can you hear me? There was an imam in Cairo who visited a school and where young girls, very young girls, were having to cover up wearing the niqab or the veil. And he was actually very angry about that. And I'm just curious how you see that, and how you might see that in the future for girls' education.
Well, now he was examined because they were wearing the face veil. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. This was in the news a few years ago, or maybe like 18 months ago. And I think it was a very important imam in Cairo who, when he visited the schools, he saw young girls wearing the full hijab, and he was actually very angry about that. How do you see that?
Well, I see that as an example of the diversity that there exists among, one imam will say that, others will say they should wear it, and so there's no, it's a matter of different opinion, and I think it's valuable that people who don't think it should be worn should stand up and say so if they have the authority of religion, like as an imam does. So I guess that's really my only comment on that.
Hi. You mentioned, going back to what you were saying about the younger generation now who are wearing the veil, for their own reasons and for religious reasons, just because it's part of what they know and what they do. So how do you deal with the modern day society who's thinking that they're actually forced into it, and this is a widespread view that a lot of Europeans now think?
Yeah. You know, I just haven't seen that any evidence that being forced into it is the norm. I mean, on the contrary, many parents were very angry with their daughters. You said, why you differentiate? Why you know, your mother didn't wear it? Why are you making yourself different in this society? And one shouldn't forget there is actually a generational battle going on. And one way for Muslim young girls to defy their parents is to put on a hijab. So all of these conditions that apply in any family, whatever religion, take other forms in different religions or people who are atheists. In Islam, the hijab can work as an intergenerational battleground. I haven't really seen much evidence. I mean, I do think if there is, I think parents do impose their views on their children about dressing altogether. Teenagers, as we know, rebel. But I don't know, we can't force parents not to tell their children they should wear hijab. I mean, in a free society, when they grow up, they'll make their own choice. So I think, but if there's evidence people are being forced to wear it, then we should investigate this as a criminal matter, not as a matter of Islam or whatever it is. You know, if there is evidence, then that should be pursued, certainly. But I don't think this is a common story.
There's a wonderful Jane Austen moment in your book where you talk about the parents being very upset because their daughters have taken on the veil, and they think that this will ruin their marital prospects, and they think, you know, who is going to marry you when you drape this on your head? And I think that really reflects that sort of intergenerational friction that can come out around the veil.
Yeah. Thank you for that, yes.
Hi. It seems to me that the discussion today is more about the Muslim women in Western countries, and I don't know how much in your discussions with Westerners who choose to wear the veil, the topic comes up as how they might be able to influence, or what thoughts go through their minds about the women in the countries where they have no choice. I mean, what kind of examples or what implications does their wearing of the veil have for women where there is no choice? I can understand the reasoning why they would choose to, as an opposition towards the Western Christian or the secular states, but is there a discussion that you can see going on for women who have the choice, who are Muslim, to wear the veil, but knowing full well that there are millions of women out there who don't have a choice? I just wonder about your thoughts about that.
From what I've never heard anyone who wears a veil supporting the idea of it being forced. All the young people that I've spoken to would not support the fact that any country should force it. In fact, it's part of their ethos that it has to be. It's meaningless if it's not something that's chosen by women. Now, whether the fact that a woman wears a hijab in America or in England is lending to support to Saudi Arabia, I really don't think it does. I mean, I don't think it'll make that much difference to Saudi Arabia. So I haven't heard them debate whether they should take it off so that Saudi Arabia doesn't enforce it on their women, because I don't think that will happen.
But do you think that perhaps the French ban, for instance, could be some sort of wish that there is a more liberal view for women to choose to wear it or not to wear it in some of the countries that obviously there is no choice for women?
Well, you know the history of banning it. I mean, Egypt banned it when it first began to spread. Turkey has banned it. So it's not only Western countries that have banned it. And it has always backfired. Particularly, I mean, in all of those countries too, when Egypt banned it, today wearing hijab is the norm, it's the majority. When Egypt banned it in the 90s, early 90s, it was still the minority who were wearing. So it's always discrimination against the minority, and that makes hundreds of people join and want to support them even simply because it's discrimination against the minority. So it's always backfired. I just don't think it's wise at all to ban it. If you want to end the the example I gave, can't remember if I gave that in the book, but in America, where people are free to wear it or not wear it, some of the intellectual women, in particular, intellectual Muslim, very committed religious believers, having grown up being told it's required, are now studying the text and concluding, no, it's not required. Some of them are saying no. So, and they're taking off, and they remain to be committed Muslims. So, I think this freedom to decide what they do. So, I think that is what that would encourage people to. Might lead to even Saudi. I can't really think that governments that impose hijab are going to be influenced by anybody, even intellectual women who are against it. But I think that is a hope. That is a sign far more effective than banning it. Just let people think for themselves and decide for themselves.
Okay, so basically there is no opportunity. Whatever we do in other countries, they're not going to influence, so you might as well not have.
Well, I think that the political climate really comes to bear on this question, because especially as you described, the veil became much more common in America, not much more, but there was an increase in veiling after September 11th, because there was such a sort of there was such a backlash to 9/11 that targeted Arabs. Sikhs were murdered because they were mistakenly taken as Muslims. And in a way, that kind of intense political climate, full of, in small and more violent ways, discrimination, I think brought for a lot of Muslim women in the States, that immediate climate became so much more of a pressing and immediate personal, moral, political, intellectual concern than what's happening in Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan. And I read and I learned in your book, where I come from in California, San Jose, a young Yemeni woman who was pregnant, 9 months pregnant, was attacked because she was wearing the veil. And so I think that sort of the determination to veil and what it means is very specific to countries and political moments, and that sort of this abstract notion that, well, I will not wear the veil because women in Afghanistan and Iran and Saudi don't have the choice, is very much tempered by what's actually happening at that moment in a European country or a Western country.
I think one should also be aware that for some people, God is requiring to wear this dress. And they have the right to believe that, and they have the right to dress. It's not up to me to tell them what they should believe, or up to anybody else. So I think. I think we should bear that in mind, as maybe it's required. Maybe some people believe this is a religious commitment.
Thanks very much. Thank you. My question is, one of the objections that a lot of people in the West, but also many people I've spoken to from Muslim-majority countries who are themselves secular and themselves quite frightened by this phenomenon and head covering, but also a lot of the other stuff that they see going along with it. Their explanation for, when I say, well, as a Western liberal, why shouldn't they wear what they want? Like you just said, this is their interpretation, and certainly as a person of faith myself, I'm not going to tell someone else how to observe their own faith. But they counter often with the argument, Islam has not undergone the Reformation or the equivalent of a Reformation. And so as a result, it is almost too dangerous to really allow to sort of do its own thing. I want to know what you would say to people who are frightened of Islam because it has not had its equivalent of a Reformation.
Well, I actually very much appreciate what you said, although the bit about the Reformation I don't agree with, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think I should point out, I don't want to romanticize hijab. I think I'm very insistent when I say that it has all these meanings, that these meanings are possible in Western societies, in societies which respect women's right to dress as they wish. I don't think they're even Saudi Arabia and Iran, of course, require it by law. But even then, and I do that. Look at this in my analysis of Egypt. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on observing Islam in a particular way. I think if I were living there, I wouldn't be too happy. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. I'm not saying it's fine for everybody, and I'm a supporter of hijab. I'm saying that in the West, and in the West there are minorities, and we're speaking about governments which have power over the minorities, about societies which have prejudice about those minorities, and it's in that context that I'm saying hijab is equivalent to any other form of dress. Now, that's not the case even in Egypt, where there is pressure to wear it. There are all kinds of things that go along with that. So I completely understand their position, and I don't want my words to be taken as saying they ought to be happy with that too. No, I'm not saying that at all.
No, I think you do a really wonderful job, very quickly, recounting the research that has documented that kind of peer pressure, yes. Especially for women who are sort of on the verge, considering wearing the veil but not sure, and these sort of Islamist women activists waiting in the fringes, buying it for them, having it ready, and that's of course a help, because that would have been something else that they would have had to buy, and then sort of springing at the right moment when that woman would be most receptive. And so that kind of peer pressure, economic pressure coming together, I think you're very honest about that in the book, with Egypt in particular. Anecdotes like that I think really sort of illustrate the whole sort of spectrum of choice and lack of choice, or how peer pressure works into choice.
That's right, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more.
I'm Roger Hardy. I interviewed you years and years ago for a BBC programme. You probably don't remember.
I do remember, yes.
Can there be, in the fullest sense, in your view, an Islamic feminism, or does the word have too much Western baggage?
Very nice, complicated question. I think many people that I might describe as Islamic feminists might reject the term feminist. They often do. Out of a reasoning that actually goes back to the early... The woman you mentioned, Zainab al-Ghazali, one of these leading Islamic figures who died in early 21st century. She, at the age of 16, joined the feminist organization in Egypt back in the 1930s. And she left it because she thought that organization was casting the issue of women's rights entirely in Western terms, and whereas, as she argued, Islam had its own vision which gave women even greater equality. So she rejected that kind of feminism. And so a lot of them do say that they're going back to a radical, feminism. They don't call it feminism, to women's rights as understood within Islam. I do think that history is history, and that we have lived through, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one should never forget that the feminist movement of America, which was really the feminist movement that spread across the world, of Europe as well, had its roots in the civil rights movement. It didn't have its roots simply in women's rights. And that this movement has achieved a great deal of thinking, of practical possibilities for women that didn't exist before 1960. And there's a huge body of knowledge now, thanks to American feminism, European feminism. And I can't believe, and I don't believe, that Muslim or not, whether you want to be a pure Islamic women's right person, you can't ignore, and it would be very unwise to ignore this extraordinary rich heritage. It's a world. I mean, I also think I don't believe these Islam in these. I think they are practical. One has to make these distinctions, but I think we live in a world where it doesn't. The margins between peoples and countries and religions are really disappearing fast, and you cannot isolate yourself as a Muslim or as a Christian or as an atheist from the body of the history of the world, and you should draw on it if you're wise.
I think you note that there's an emerging field of feminist scholarship of Islam, or however we want to arrange those three words, yes. Islamic feminist scholarship, yeah. That is seeking to reinterpret a lot of what has come down as Islamic knowledge or law through a feminist Islamic light. And you mention the woman Lala Bakhtiar, who's reinterpreted a very important verse of the Quran that relates to women, and you recount how so many feminist Muslim women have sort of undergone such a sort of internal inability to square their faith with that verse, in which had been understood that the verse means that man can beat his wife. The verb to beat is understood as meaning that in that verse. And this new interpretation has found a very different meaning for it, to abandon or to leave.
Yes.
And that kind of scholarship is sort of bringing to bear these kind of questions of feminism into these sort of pockets of Islamic heritage that were sort of most problematic when it came to the question of women.
That's right. And this is very parallel, I mean, to the history of biblical criticism, whether in relation to Judaism or Christianity. So that heritage is alive and being explored in Islam as well now.
And contested,
yeah.
As you're showing.
Yeah.
I'm told that we can have a couple of more if there's anyone who had their burning question ready. If there's anyone here in the front, there's a couple.
Hi, just to make a comment, just to follow up on the ban in France of the niqab. I think that this discourse is just populist and hypocritical, because Sarkozy, a few years ago, went to Saudi Arabia and praised them for their democratic progress and human rights record. So if we want to change things really, we need to condemn Saudi Arabia and their records on oppression of women, not by banning the niqab and playing into the populist agenda.
I just was wondering what you see for the future and the exploration of Islam that's going on in the West. What kind of impact that can have in the future, especially with reference to, say, the feminist interpretations of Islam. And how do you see this impacting Muslims throughout the world?
Yes. Very good question that I can't answer, but I think you're right. I think we are. I mean, I think you quoted that part when I said we are at a new point in the history of Islam, the history of America, but really the history of the West, because it's unprecedented what's happening. Islam itself is transforming, but it's transforming in a Western context. How all of this is going to shape history. I mean, I have no doubt it will be a tremendous impact. And the way that Islam is being reinterpreted by women will surely someday have a huge impact worldwide too. Yeah.
But far into the future, do you see any immediate changes or anything?
Immediate changes? No, I think it's no. I mean, I think I can't. I can't tell you. As you know, one of the things I do in my book is quote a historian called Albert Horani, who's a very well-known, established, the author of History of the Arab Peoples, a best-selling book just a few years ago. And he wrote in 1955 saying the veil is soon going to be a thing of the past. It's vanishing from the Muslim world, from the Arab Middle East. Well, he was a great historian, and his prediction has proved to be completely wrong. So I don't think people who do history should be predicting the future.
Shall we end on that note? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.